All right. Hello, everyone. Can you hear me okay? Can everyone hear me okay? Okay, amazing. Hi, everyone, and welcome. Thank you so much for joining us tonight. My name is Gina Pepitone, and I'm the editor-in-chief of Contrast, and I'm so excited to present to you Self Contrast Spring Fashion Show in collaboration with the Lobe, the French and Francophone Studies Department, and the Costume Shop, who have brought these two wonderful pieces for exhibition tonight. Okay, so for those of you who might not be familiar, Contrast is Vassar's entirely student-run fashion and culture magazine. Each semester we produce a publication featuring editorial articles and fashion-focused photo shoots inspired by a central theme. And this spring, our executive board landed on the word self. What I find most compelling about this theme and what the word self evokes is a form of exploration of individuality, identity, and self-discovery. The particular focus of today's fashion show serves to highlight the connection between fashion and self, exploring ideas of performance and presentation, creativity, and self-expression. Contrast has styled a set of looks today made by pieces sourced from students on campus, whether they be upcycled, sewn, knit, or crocheted. I hope you enjoy the artistry, creativity, and personality that each look will bring to the runway. But before we get into the fashion show, we have with us virtually our speaker for today's event. So I will pass the mic to Professor Susan Heiner of the French Department to introduce Gwen.
Thank you, Gina. Welcome, everyone. Good evening. Welcome to the annual Contrast Fashion Show. This event was postponed, of course, for a year, but we're back and it's going to be a wonderful evening. My name is Susan Heiner and I'm the chair of French and Francophone Studies and a friend of this event. In fact, I've had the pleasure of helping the Contrast group select a speaker for this event each year. And this year I knew exactly who to ask. Gwendolyn Gruel is the Onassis Lecturer in Ancient Greek Thought and Language in the Department of Philosophy at the New School in Social Research for New York City. She did her undergraduate work at Sarah Lawrence College and earned her joint doctoral degree in philosophy and classics from Tulane University. Among her numerous publications, she also has two books set to appear very soon, one entitled Thinking of Death in Plato's Euthydemus. I apologize for the mispronunciation. Okay, well done. A close reading and new translation to be published at Oxford University Press. And the other, which will likely interest this crowd even more, called Fashion Sense on Philosophy and Fashion, set to come out at Bloomsbury Academic also in 2022. Finally, I just want to add that this evening is something of a homecoming for Gwen. She was the Blagan Fellow in 2019-20 here at Vassar, so some of you may have taken classes with her. Please join me in welcoming Gwen Gruel, whose lecture tonight is entitled Fashion and Self, Style Revolt.
Thank you, Susan. Hopefully everybody can hear me okay. And hi to everybody on the webinar. I see some people I know. Okay, so I thought I would begin with a revolt. I'm going to share my screen and hopefully it's not going to make me too small. And let me pull up my slideshow. So, okay. I want to show you some images from the Vassar archives. These come courtesy of Vassar senior Emma Yadanza, who found and photographed them for me. They're from 100 years ago. So this is Vassar in 1921. And the title of my talk, Style Revolt, is taken from this page in the scrapbook of a graduate of 1924. So I highlighted here a little bit of the handwritten text for you. And you'll see that a style revolt took place on January 27th, 1921. It was apparently in response to a criticism about how Vassar students dressed. Now, you might wonder, what were they wearing? And who was criticizing them? Did they look too stodgy, too unladylike? Now, I did a little bit of research and I learned that In the 1860s, Vassar had a very strict president who instituted a conservative dress code. But by the early 1900s, Vassar students had acquired a reputation for looking somewhat unkempt in comparison to, say, Smith students. One of the graduates of the class of 1918, Julia Antolini, remarked some years later on the poor dress of the students, saying, quote, "The average level of intelligence is probably high, but the level of clothes sense and taste is low." She then wonders, is there a type of dress that indicates brains and absolves one from attention to attractiveness, grooming, and other standards? Whatever it was that led the students to revolt in 1921, the revolt involved the following. They made themselves as unattractive as possible. They drew back their hair into tight buns, and they wore their tackiest clothes, and they sang Farmer in the Dell in front of Rockefeller. That part's really weird, but I think important. The phrase style revolt is an interesting one. In their sarcastic donning of ugly clothes in a revolting protest, the students appear to be having fun. That kind of fun, the kind of fun that you have when you don't look the way people expect, or when you reject the status quo in order to show your superior savviness, something like wearing an ugly Christmas sweater with a wink. That kind of fun is something that, while it's not peculiar to fashion, is ubiquitously present in fashion. But fashion's influence can be inverted from style revolts to revolt style, and there fashion packs a different kind of punch. It can be used to combat prejudices and to make statements about identity. So I've got a couple slides to show you about this. In the 1960s, Martin Luther King Jr. and civil rights protesters wore their Sunday best, dressed in elegant suits, in order to overturn racial stereotyping. But, and you can see, I don't know if you can see my cursor. I think maybe you can. You can see James Foreman has overalls underneath his suit. And King and other activists also famously staged protests dressed down in jeans, in fact, leading to the rise of popularity in denim. The significance of denim, here's another slide showing Martin Luther King Jr. Wearing workwear. The significance of this denim for Black Americans, James Sullivan writes, was, quote, "a painful reminder of the old sharecropper system to show that nothing had changed. So James Brown had refused to wear jeans and he forbade his band from ever wearing them." Someone who inspired Martin Luther King, Gandhi, another famous revolutionary who had a revolt style. It's a lesser known fact about Gandhi that in his law student days in London, Gandhi had a fascination with neckties and he dressed like a dandy. In his autobiography, he writes about succumbing to the fashion goddess. The Gandhi we know looks very different, very unlike a dandy, but the significance of his style remains. He used a simple piece of homespun khadi cloth as a symbol for the independence and the self-reliance of India. And for a short time, the spinning wheel was the symbol on the Indian flag. Now, I want to pause here to think for a bit about what I've said so far, which I know is already a lot. I'm going to throw a lot at you. I'm going to read you a quote. This is from Benjamin, from the concept of history, on the concept of history. It's the top quote. The bottom quote is the quote that inspired Benjamin. So Benjamin says, "The French Revolution understood itself as Rome reincarnated. It cited ancient Rome as also fashion cites a past costume. Fashion keeps to the hunt for the present day, wherever it moves in the thicket of the once. It is a tiger's leap into the past." This tiger's leap is not a whimsical, aimless leap, but a leap that's hunting. What is fashion hunting? Benjamin says fashion is keeping to the scent of the now, in the thicket of the once. And he's here appealing to this earlier remark made by Marx about revolution, taking on fashions of the past in order to revolutionize the present. So Marx's quote is down below, and he says, during times of revolutionary crisis, human beings anxiously conjure up into their service the spirits of the past, borrowing their names, battle cries, and costumes to perform a new world historical scene in this time-honored disguise and with this borrowed language. Fashion in particular, with a simple change of hats, can move ideas across time in a way that seems almost to smirk at historical context. It takes styles that were once rejected and transforms them into progressive patterns. So art historian Alexander Nagel calls every movement in fashion an anachronic time bomb. In other words, a blast from the past. Just when you thought shoulder pads were gone forever, here they come again with a new swagger. More ancient styles return looking utterly estranged, like the paleo diet, or Lil Nas X quoting Plato's Symposium in his Montero music video. I have a slide of this, in Greek, I might add. Being hip is like being a revolutionary, bringing what is out back in at a critical moment. In Aristophanes' Knights, a sausage seller competing with a leather seller for the attention of an old man named Deimos gives Deimos a pair of slippers and a tunic. And Deimos says, "This tunic is a greater discovery than that of Themistocles moving the port of Athens to the Piraeus." Now, the tunic itself is not so special, but the sausage seller shifts its meaning out of common use and retailors it for the moment. So fashion says, to give a more contemporary example, look at this tattered old pair of jeans. They've been around forever. You might think they're just ordinary, but now they've been reborn in the Renaissance that is grunge. Fashion's novelty does not so much change how we look, but how we see. And in the examples I've given you, you can see fashion has an enormous power to alter the fabric of reality. By the same turn, fashion's power can be destructive, especially when it makes appearances seem equivalent to the way things are. It was for that reason that Socrates had to throw poetic novelty out of his ideal city in Plato's Republic. The noble lie, if you know that phrase, was an attempt to obliterate the distinction between the origin of things and their current fashions. In Thucydides' History of the Peloponnesian War, a fashion change forecasts the fate of Athens. So this is a longer quote, but I'll paraphrase it for you. The Athenians used to dress in a kind of old-fashioned patriotic style. They wore cicada clips in their hair to indicate that they were born from the earth like cicadas. In other words, that they were native to the land they occupied. But their change to a more modest, non-local, Spartan look, that is, taken from their rivals, and to exercising completely naked. This was an omen for the outcome of the war. The new Athenian look said, "We're all equal. We no longer use contrived distinctions." But this cosmopolitan democracy led Athens to imperially extend its boundaries farther and farther outward. The symbol of liberation in nudity thus became the sign of the very conformity it was meant to reject. So fashion, to collect some of these threads, is quite broad. It can mean not only costumes, but also customs. In fact, in some languages, the two words are the same. We have an English word habit, which means not only a pattern of a garment, but also a pattern of behavior. Fashion is italics. Fashion is a poetic or rhetorical flourish on the plane. Fashion is a punctuation mark, which is already suggestive of some grammatical corset. Fashion can both adorn the top of the surface or put it into order. There's a single word for this in Greek, kosmein, from which we get both cosmos and cosmetic. Cosmos too is a Greek word, and it can mean not only world order, but also dress or ornament. The stars and planets are sometimes depicted as if they were jewels called kosmoi. And in a myth at the end of Plato's Gorgias, Zeus is said to have stopped the trials of souls in clothing, because clothes make the wicked look more beautiful than they really are. They need to be removed so as not to cloud judgment. But the judges too have to remove their clothes in order to judge fairly. So let me read you this slide. Then they must be judged naked of altogether all those things, for it's necessary to judge them dead. And it's necessary too for the judge to be naked, being dead, observing with the soul itself immediately after each has died, deserted from all kin, and leaving behind on earth that adornment, cosmos entire, so that the judgment may be just. Now, whatever cosmos means here, if being naked is akin to being dead, that would suggest we can never be naked until we're dead. To judge well requires leaving behind the cosmos in both senses, as world and as dress. Fashion, you could say, is not the world, but it can make the world, just as rhetoric is not the argument, but can make the argument. But this is part of a worry about fashion. Its force seems somehow illegitimate, entering in, as it seems to do, from the outside and affecting the whole, like time seems to overtake us and yet to be within us. So I want to anticipate a sort of, I don't know, you're all very small, so I can't really see in your masks, so I can't see your faces. But I'm anticipating that someone out there, either in the Lobe or in cyberspace, might have an objection here. So I've just cited Aristophanes and Thucydides and Plato on fashion, but isn't fashion a modern thing? Fashion historians generally date it to as early as the late medieval period or as late as the 1850s. That's when they say fashion arrived. Before that time, it was either effortlessly absent or present without our having before noticed it. Perhaps there were finely made clothes, technically beautiful. But the introduction of fashion, according to fashion historians, has more to do with an awareness of time in art and individual expression in clothing. Now, I obviously think fashion is much older, but what I'm really intrigued by is the notion of fashion having any beginning at all. Fashion seems to have an endless drive. It drives itself towards a moment of singularity when it will unveil itself in the perfect outfit, the perfect look, or in fashion photography, the perfect shot. Each look gets recycled into the next, as if the process would be never ending, like a snake shedding its skin, and yet also somehow intending to make a revelation. Perhaps in the end, the perfect outfit would be like perfect nudity, an outfit so suitable that it would be unnoticeable. To quote Coco Chanel, dress shabbily and they remember the dress, dress impeccably and they remember the woman. It's hard too not to think of the Garden of Eden. There too, a time is imagined when clothes did not affect our judgment. And if fashion has an origin and came to be, it might be possible to imagine someday living without it. So you could say when people accuse fashion of being superficial, a lot is at stake, namely the possibility of stripping the self, stripping it of its motives, its beguilements, its circumstances, its various modes, to strip the self and to reveal it as an independent agent. And yet, fashion's force seems to be akin to a digression on a main thought, a series of unnecessary ruffles that perhaps might be ironed out. It's often perceived as too fickle for serious people who are concerned with substance. And it's true, what the fashion police deem uncool one day often becomes extremely cool and fashionable the next. Fashion is very clever too in having words to paper over its caprice. It speaks about basics, necessities, must-haves, essentials, as if the proper wardrobe would involve a mastery of all contingency, weather, occasion, age, even mortality. Yet particular articles of clothing call out to us like lovers, begging us to take them home, and try as you might to rationalize why you wanted that particular shirt or why you tied your scarf in that particular way, perhaps it felt familiar or right. But such words only defer fashion's resistance to being intellectualized, much to the horror, of course, of intellectuals who would like to say that fashion is rather recently acquired and so easily dispensed with. But again, fashion is not the dress, but the way the dress hangs. It's not the collar, but the popped collar. As thinking is not the thought, but its mode. And it's this peripheral pose that fashion strikes on a subject's person that seems to lead us, when people criticize our clothes, to take it straight to the heart, to revolt, as if it were an attack on our most inward and uncontrollable preferences, or an attack on our freedom to choose what we like and what we don't. You might even wonder if excessively fashionable people have a kind of lust for control, to master themselves and the world. In Beauvoir's Second Sex, she describes in lurid detail the role that fashion plays for married women. Marriage is a sort of buttoned up state in which a woman finds herself, according to Beauvoir, ridiculously drawn to all sorts of fashion finery, especially very uncomfortable garments and way too much jewelry. She adorns herself in her interior with a kind of rigor and devotion through which she becomes an object of worship. But there's one escape, a secret love affair. An affair is like a revolt. It offers freedom from commitment, freedom from patterned behavior. It creates the experience of serendipity, like a fancy pair of platform shoes that you don't need, and yet which call out to you, take me, I must have you. In an affair, a woman is free to indulge for her own sake, and she gains a renewed sense of herself, not as a trapped object, but as a free subject. So I'll throw a couple of quotations up here so you can see what I mean. Hopefully you can read them. The first one is a description of this trap of obsessing about appearance. So she's like a painting, a statue, like an actor on stage, an analogon through which is suggested an absent subject who is her character but is not she, and so on. And the second quote is about the liberation that's experienced through the affair. So, hold on, I'm moving myself. Her husband's too mundane gaze no longer nurtures her image. She needs eyes still full of mystery to discover her as mystery. She needs a sovereign consciousness before her to receive her confidences, to revive the faded photographs, to bring to life that dimple in the corner of her mouth, the fluttering eyelashes that are hers alone. She is only desirable, lovable, if she is desired, loved. So one thing to notice is that Beauvoir's own prose is decked out with rather pretty phrases. It is, I think, a poetic affair, an affair with words, which is to say, not domesticated and not stiff. She rejects fashion on the one hand as a trap, but the fun she has in critiquing it seems all too easily confused with fashion. Now, in an interview from 1960, Beauvoir says, as you might expect, I must tell you that I'm not at all interested in clothes. But she looks, of course, impeccable and speaks with delight about the treasures in her house, her rather special Angora sweaters, and a horrible crepe de chine dress. So last semester, I had assigned these two readings to my graduate students, and one of them objected very passionately and said, well, why can't she contradict herself? Why can't she just have fun with fashion? Why do we have to over-intellectualize it? And it's true, over-intellectualizing is a kind of buzzkill. Explaining fashion is a little like explaining a joke. It goes along with demanding that people be perfectly consistent, that they never surprise us, and that their words, as their clothes, always match their actions. But such a perfectly consistent person, a person who dresses like an intellectual because they're an intellectual, would be neither free nor fun, nor able for that matter to revolt, or perhaps even to think. Indeed, if fashion were to become perfectly rational, as serious minds demanded that it be, questioning appearances would be impossible. Fashion is, in another way, that which indicates the presence of the self, and without which the self could not express itself in the first person. And so, to come to our main event, what is this self to which I refer? Now, I want to read you one last quote. Oh, here's another picture of Simone de Beauvoir in her house, looking lovely. This last quote is a long one. It's from James Baldwin, Nothing Personal, 1964. And it's about the self. So Baldwin begins, it's always been much easier because it's always seemed much safer to give a name to the evil without than to locate the terror within. And yet, the terror within is far truer and far more powerful than any of our labels. The labels change, the terror is constant. And this terror has something to do with that irreducible gap between the self one invents, the self one takes oneself as being, which is, however, and by definition, a provisional self, and the undiscoverable self, which always has the power to blow the provisional self to bits. Now, he goes on to compare the self to a kind of fabric. The self one has sewn together with such effort, you can discover one night that the self you've sewn together with such effort is all dirty rags, is unusable, is gone. And out of what raw material will one build a self again? The lives of men, and therefore of nations, to an extent literally unimaginable, depend on how vividly this question lives in the mind. Now, the undiscoverable self is somehow disembodied from its particular iterations. It can say to itself, I am more than I once was, or I wish I were more like what I was once. And there's an ordinary experience with clothes that illuminates this. So I think, we have this ordinary experience where either you compliment someone's outfit or someone compliments your outfit, and you're compelled to ask, where'd you get it? Where'd you get those shoes? Where'd you get that shirt? Where did it come from? You want to know. What's its story? What's its history? What's the motive behind its appearance? We even have a phrase, looking smart, which praises not the outfit, but the fashioning behind the outfit. And yet, most of us don't actually know where our clothes come from. Brand names give you the impression of an origin, but saying your shirt is from Gucci won't shed any light on the agency expressed by the strangeness of clothes on the body. By that I mean the touch of clothes on your skin, which makes you all too aware that they're not the same as you, that some self seems to wrestle behind them and in them. The American ideal of comfort seems designed to return us to that mythical position wherein our clothes don't provoke us. They don't make us think about the gap between how we appear and how we are. The more comfortable we are, the more we cease to recall the presence of ourselves in distinction from the way we are outfitted. We forget the question of ourselves in comfortable clothes, as we do in comfortable patterns of thought. We can even speak of times in our lives when we were more comfortable in our own skin, as if aging involved the unwilling adoption of a variety of bodies to clothe the ever-changing self. But the need for comfortable clothes suggests that there's something, in general, uncomfortable about clothes. And just as fashion drugs us with notions that the right dress today will be wrong tomorrow, so beauty rituals defer to that same undiscoverable meta self, as if a facial peel would discover the undiscoverable, would reveal the self at a perfect peak, where time stops and the true self, your best self, has arrived. We have phrases like, how becoming, as if a state of coming to be were equivalent to a state of being. That's so you, we say, as if you could discover yourself in the mirror of a garment. Or even stranger, the phrase, this is a fashion phrase, own it. Own what? Does owning it mean coming into your own, or just being yourself no matter what? Be yourself too suggests that yourself is an attitude or outfit you could put on like an allegiance or a coat. It apparently involves letting go of every pretension that clothes you, except of course, the clothing of yourself, which is a kind of nudity that you must wear. Now, the ancient Greeks had a handful of words for that critical time when the self comes out as more itself for just a moment, when it's neither a child nor an adult. We would say the coming of age moment. This is a moment of perfect transition. In Greek, it's called either the prime, hora, the critical time, kairos, or the bloom of youth, Hebe, who's also a goddess. The bloom is an ageless point where the self seems neither to ascend nor descend, but simply to be, just before the clock strikes noon, or just after it begins to move past it. No longer a wannabe, not yet a has-been. The prime is the age that Aristotle touts in the Rhetoric as a mean on the excesses of youth and old age. But to be in such a state of bloom would require having lived to the end of your life so that you could judge which of yourselves wore yourself best. Otherwise, how could you know when the bloom is upon you? It's here that the look of Athens's academy gym and the athleisure style of the 21st century oddly meet. Now I'm going to leave you with one final image. This image, which I made. Athleisure, you all probably know what it is. It one-ups comfortable clothes by making it appear as if you're not even yet in clothes, but only on your way to being in them. Athleisure done correctly is like those classical Greek sculptures for which Polykleitos was famous. This is a Polykleitos sculpture, the Diadumenos. This sort of sculpture exposes the body in a pose, caught off duty, suspended in the act of moving from here to there, a leisure wear that nowadays we ironically call performance wear. Athleisure suggests a spectator's view on the sport of life. Why wear your gym outfit everywhere but the gym? Because you're not defined by practical matters, such as dates, deadlines, push-ups. You're actively engaged in the state of inactivity. In the Theaetetus, Socrates describes the ideal philosopher in this way. He doesn't know his way to the courthouse, but you'll probably find him hanging out in the gym wrestling with arguments. Elsewhere, in the Phaedo, Socrates says that philosophy is the practice of dying and being dead. Now, what leisure and death have to do with one another is where I want to end. You could put these two things together, I think, and say that the burial of the self in clothing, particularly in clothing that we call leisure wear, is an attempt to reveal it as having transcended its particular outfits. Being at leisure and in leisure means not paying heed to time. It brings you closer not so much to the bloom of youth, but the bloom of death. To imagine a time when there was no fashion and we were at leisure from our looks and from the looks of others, when we were comfortable, would be like imagining a time in which we cease to feel time's effect. If only we could forget that we die. I'm afraid fashion is the sign of our mortality. To get rid of it, as in the Gorgias, we'd have to die. So too, I think, neutral thinking, unfashioned thinking, means putting on a simulation of leisure, a leisure suit. But neither fashion nor thinking can finally escape appearing. Since just as thinking begins as a reflection and therefore not at the beginning, we come to know clothes through the second thoughts of fashion. And through these second thoughts, we come to think the thought of a self beyond clothes, a self that longs to be able to express its substance on the surface. And yet, it's only because the self can never fully undress itself that every outfit, like every word, is unfathomably deep. Thank you.
All right, so I'm happy to convey any questions the room might have to Gwen. Apparently, she can't hear you, so I have to repeat your questions. If you have any questions or comments you'd like to ask, we have a really full house, Gwen. I don't know if you can see everybody. But
Well, now I can only see you, but
oh, sorry about that.
I did see you. I saw the
Out
crowd.
in the back room, in the antechamber, and on the wing as well. So
Cool.
any questions for Gwen? That was a really wonderful talk. Thank you so much. It was excellent and very rich.
Thanks for having me.
A lot to think about. Doesn't look like I see any hands. They're all like, having midterms, so hard to come up with questions. Well, if there are no questions, I think then what we need to do is give you a huge round of applause and thank you so much once again.
Now I can see everybody. Thank you. Wow, there's so many people.
We're now going to take about maybe a 5-minute break so that Brandon can rearrange all the tech stuff and clear the runway for the fashion show. All right. Gwen, you'll be able to watch the fashion show.
Cool.
All right. Thank you.
Bye.